So, in response to someone that didn't necessarily understand that Jim Crow wasn't an actual person, very common mistake. I made it when I was 7. We're driving down to Disneyland, and we're driving through Torrance for some reason, and Torrance was a part of Los Angeles that was racially segregated by law, and so there are a group of people from CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, that were holding signs that said, "Jim Crow must go." So I asked my parents, who is this Jim Crow, and why don't they like him? And they kind of explained, what Jim Crow was, not so much who. Jim Crow was a what, not a who. But there was a person. So Jim Crow is a fictional person who represents type 4 legal discrimination. It is legal to discriminate. The state then reinforces that. And I'll show you how that came from where this poster is, right? So it's okay if you thought Jim Crow was a person. Rookie mistake. It's the name for a policy, just like Uncle Sam is a fictional person. John Bull of England, fictional person, but representing the United States and England, respectively. So it's actually a song. Jump Jim Crow is a song and dance from 1828. It was done in blackface by white comedian T.D. Dartmouth, T.D. Daddy Rice. The first song was supposedly inspired by the song and dance of a crippled African slave called Jim Cuff, or Jim Crow, variously claimed to have resided in St. Louis, Cincinnati, or Pittsburgh. Quite a range there, but understand the original was basically a black person who was singing on the streets, trying to make money, probably because he couldn't work, being crippled. So they basically stole his riff and did it in blackface. So it's like a parody. But it goes beyond there. So it became a great 19th century hit. So if you go to Wikipedia and talk and see this, so great 19th century hit. Rice performed all over the country as Daddy Jim Crow. As a result of Rice's fame, Jim Crow had become a pejorative, meaning African Americans, by 1838. Short 10 years later, and from this, the laws of racial segregation became known as Jim Crow laws. The expression "jump Jim Crow" came to mean to act like a stereotyped stage character of a black person. Okay, see, you could also see a parallel. Uncle Tom actually, if you read the book, freed slaves and was killed by 2 black slaves under the direction of a white overseer. And he was killed because he helped slaves get free. The shuffling act was basically an act to survive. So there's a Wikipedia, "Come listen all you gals and boys, I's just from Tucky-Ho. I'm going to sing a little song, my name's Jim Crow." And the chorus after every verse, "Wheel about and turn about and do just so. Every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow. I went down to the river, I didn't mean to stay, but there I seen so many gals I couldn't get away. I whipped my weight in wildcats, I eat an alligator. I drunk the Mississippi up. I'm the very creature. I sit upon a hornet's nest, I dance upon my bed. I tie a wiper around my neck, and then I go to bed. I kneel to the buzzard, and I bow to the crow. And every time I wheel about, I jump just so." So in standard English, "Come listen, all you girls and boys, I'm just from Tuckahoe. I'm going to sing a little song, my name's Jim Crow. Wheel about and turn about and do just so. Every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow. I went down to the river, I didn't mean to stay, but there I saw so many girls I couldn't get away. I'm roaring on the fiddle, and down in old Virginia, they say I play the scientific like Master Paganini. I cut so many monkey shines, I dance the gallopade, and when I'm done, I rest my head on shovel, hoe, or spade." the dough upon the foot and stuck them in the fire. We're talking about hoe cakes, in case you didn't know about hoe cakes. Cornmeal cakes cooked over a fire using a hoe or a shovel as the skillet. So that's Jim Crow, which basically became the policies of American version of apartheid. Lynching is not Willie Lynch. Captain John Lynch of Virginia, everything starts in Virginia, became a model for what could be politely called frontier justice, but was often described as recreational or culinary terms. Some lynchings are more horrific than others. Now, I was raised with this knowledge by people who witnessed or personally knew victims of lynching. So it was a standard secret knowledge with those raised what I call, quote, old school black, to teach their children early and often about what you're about to see. This was standard knowledge. Right? So as part of the African American experience, there's no point in sugarcoating it because it's not how we roll. All right? So today, when they speak of a war on terrorism, this was terror on American soil, with no sanctuary for the targets and victims. The cavalry was not coming to rescue us, neither the Lone Ranger or Zorro. So, last warning, those of you who are watching this, parental guidance recommended. The following slides have links and content that could be considered child abuse if you're a white child. If you're a black child, this was the standard version of the unvarnished, unsugar-coated, healthy dose of real deal African American experience. It was required viewing. This is what I was exposed to at 7, after my first racial attack. And that's standard black psychology. You teach the child about what their experience, if they can form the question, you basically give them all they need to deal with it. So, required viewing at that age if you experience potential racial attacks of any intensity. So, I was made aware of lynching at 7 with the example of Emmett Till. It was out of our parents' fear that they gave us whippings to keep us self-disciplined. Now, that would be considered child abuse today. I didn't raise my children like that. My children, having experienced racial attacks in Eugene, basically chose, we're not necessarily multiracial or biracial, we're black women. They chose to take that defensive stance. So we did have an interesting conversation about whether they keep calling Obama black. He's biracial. I said, you know why they call him black. You experienced that. Well, why can't he claim his white side? He can barely claim his black side, really. Can't talk about race. Or isn't. Can't defend black people that come under attack in his administration. Surrounding himself with rich white boys, but that's another thing, right? So, the beatings might not be as random as racial attacks for discipline, but we were assured white people could do much worse. So at each one of these sites, I'm not going to go to them now, but American lynching without sanctuary is where the slide I'm about to teach you came from. It's a book. It started out as a traveling exhibit. So here's what's deep about this without sanctuary. I decided, it is by black people. And so here's what Without Sanctuary is. It's a coffee table book, meaning it's big enough. And what it was is a traveling art exhibit, how it fits into art. It's lynching photography that was made, the photographs were made into postcards and sent through the mail. So it's curated, and this is why I think it's like black people, because it's curated like it's an art exhibit. right? And so when so each one of these photographs, then there's like hundreds or thousands of them. I have the book, and the site's still up. So each one of them, and the lead, when you go to the site, the lead picture is a picture of the lynching that I'm about to show you. Okay, so part of what this was, they were sent through the mail. And so in the exhibit, they basically talk about, what kind of photograph it is and the approximate time and the backstory if they've got the backstory. A famous lynching that basically, even though this is more or less, is still within the time period, Mary Turner. And there's a YouTube, which is basically a series of slides, not necessarily of the lynching itself, but one of the lynching purportedly of her husband, or could have been a lynching very similar to her husband's. And like I said, I would implore you to do appropriate self-care after viewing it. But I've basically never not shown this since we've been televised, because you got to see it. This is part of my upbringing. So guess what? You get it too. So understand what this was. Doing satyagraha and nonviolent was in response to this. This was the provocation to test our Jedi satyagrahic powers. Okay, so given that this was going on, and we didn't respond violently, America's lucky. So, Jesse Washington. So, Jesse Washington was a mentally retarded, we call him developmentally disabled, but a mentally retarded 17-year-old boy. On May 8th, 1916, Lucy Fryer, a white woman, was murdered in Robinson, 7 miles from Waco. Waco, yeah. Washington, a laborer on a farm, confessed, that's in quotes, to the murder. In a brief trial on May 15th, the prosecutors had only to present a murder weapon and Washington's confession. So a reasonable person with reasonable doubt might ask as to motive. Why would a mentally retarded teenager kill his employer? Was she beating him? He's defending himself. What? There any exculpatory evidence? What? A reasonable person might ask, how was the confession obtained? As in legally? As in, let's see, like the Central Park rape case where the 5 guys that went down for it didn't do it. There was no DNA evidence for it. Dude later confessed to it, and DNA evidence matched him, even as these guys spent nearly a decade in prison for a rape that they did not commit. And the New York Police Department did not do due diligence at all. Right? So this has implications for today. Anyway, did he do the murder? So the jury deliberated for 4 minutes, and the guilty verdict was read to shouts of, "Get that nigger." So they did. He was beaten and dragged to the suspension bridge spanning the Brazos River. Thousands roared, "Burn him!" Bonfire preparations were already underway in the public square, where Washington was beaten with shovels and bricks. 15,000 men, women, and children packed the square. They climbed up poles and onto the tops of cars, hung from windows, and sat on each other's shoulders. Children were lifted by their parents into the air. Now, the opening scene on this website is a shot of, all you can make out in the center is like a tree and some smoke. There's also some photographs of people actually hoisting their children up to get a better view of this. Washington was castrated, and his ears were cut off. A tree supported the iron chain that lifted him above the fire of boxes and sticks. Wailing, the boy attempted to climb the skillet-hot chain. For this, the men cut off his fingers. The executioners repeatedly lowered the boy into the flames and hoisted him out again. With each repetition, a mighty shout was raised. Lynchers often paraded their victim down the main street through black neighborhoods and in front of colored schools that were in session. And this was done with his body. This is what's left. And this is the postcard. So it's captioned, charred corpse of Jesse Washington suspended from utility pole, May 16th, 1916, Robinson, Texas. Gelatin silver print, real photo postcard, 5.5 by 3.5. I know this is black folks doing it because only we would do this to this detail. Just report the facts. Now, I said this is a postcard sent through the mail, right? So yeah, this is basically before his body was actually, left in front of some black community center and then hung up in a butcher shop for a period of time. So this is right after he's essentially dead, charred. Written on the back of this postcard, this is the barbecue we had last night. My picture is to the left with a cross over it. Your son, Joe. Joe's leaning up against the pole. Joe would still be considered and was considered at the time, because again, remember, this is witnessed by thousands of people. I'm not certain that a murder verdict ends in an execution like this, but yeah. He would be considered normal, well-adjusted, sane human being by today's standards, and if Washington had been found innocent and still treated in this manner, no jury would have convicted Joe. So the idea, one of the code names for picnic, this is one of those things called a black urban, what I call a black urban legend. So black urban legend is actually true, but some people don't believe it because it's so horrific. So the code name for the word picnic, so if you go to the dictionary to look at the derivation of the word picnic, it's from the French pique-nique, to choose a meal. But there is some credibility, especially given the history of lynching, and given when this happened. People would actually do these lynchings after church, with children watching. And so when Ida Wells Barnett basically is, we're documenting 10,000 of these in a red record. So periods of lynching included what was referred to as the gay 90s, the 1890s, as well as the decade before the Harlem Renaissance, which we'll be studying. It's coming up, yeah. So the Harlem Renaissance was also a response to lynching. So this is the African American experience, to be aware that you have to carry the burden and responsibility of terrible and wonderful secret knowledge, and like Cassandra of old, not to be believed in either case. So in case you're not understanding Cassandra was a priestess of the goddess at Troy who prophesied that Troy would be destroyed and how it would be destroyed, and her father, the king, didn't believe her. Okay, so fact, the terrorism which maintained slavery is still very much present. For example, the James Byrd killing. The white men who killed James Byrd, basically by dragging him behind the truck, and they left his body in front of a black church, I believe it was, what was left of it. The white men who killed James Byrd are the first white men sentenced to death for killing a black man in Texas since slavery. Okay, and the man who was sentenced to death in slavery killed somebody else's slave. It was not illegal to kill your own slave. Okay, so the African American experience is be aware of the possibility that normal Americans could commit violence against you, not be considered mentally ill, and you have no legal recourse nor psychological help for the trauma. So we haven't seen such disregard for human life since the last school, theater, or temple shooting, not to mention church burning. So this is why I believe, I may be crazy, but school shooters are not mentally ill. They're simply socialized to violence, like this was. Thousands of these were happening. This was terrorism. The body count is higher than bin Laden's. Nothing was done. The perpetrators were known and went unprosecuted until black district attorneys were elected decades later. So now it's a problem all of a sudden when white shooters are killing white kids at Newtown, but it's not a problem when white people are bombing churches and doing this. Karma is a bitch. Very frustrating. Okay. So the regions of Africa most affected by the slave trade. So if I were going to got my Macintosh back from the shop and it still can't display the image. Anyway, the regions of Africa most affected by the slave trade, basically in this area, West Africa, so for example, 173 African kingdoms and city-states affected, at least 12 million shipped to the Americas, up to another 10 to 12 million killed or died in the process of getting 12 million shipped to the Americas. 45 plus distinct ethnic groups, 10 to 15 are the most prominent according to the records that the slavers kept. So the Bakongo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Angola. The Amande of Upper Guinea, Gebe speakers of Togo, Ghana, and Benin, Ajamina, Ewe, and Fon, Bikan of Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, the Wolof of Senegal and the Gambia, the Igbo of southeastern Nigeria, the Mbundu of Angola, which includes the Ambundu and Ovi Mbundu, branches of that, the Yoruba of southwestern Nigeria, the Chamba of Cameroon, the Makua of Mozambique. So, even assuming these are population densities of Africa, 106 million in 1750, 133 million in 1900, and 750 million now, theoretically, and a max of 24 million involved. That means roughly 1 in 5 Africans were involved in the slave trade, either killed or shipped to the Americas, meaning Africa still had a viable and vital population, but still subject to assault and exploitation, as we shall see. So, contemporary slavery is in Africa, Bangladesh, China, Europe, India, Mali, Mauritania, North Korea, Pakistan, Sudan, and the United States. So types of slavery, which include bride buying, child labor, debt bondage, human trafficking, peonage, penal labor, sexual slavery, sweatshop labor, and wage slavery. And notice it doesn't talk about student debt there yet, but they're working on it. So the Berlin Conference. Here's what the Berlin Conference was. Meeting at the Berlin residence of Chancellor Otto von Bismarck in 1884, the foreign ministers of 14 European powers and the U.S., established ground rules for the future exploitation of the, quote, dark continent. Africans were not invited or made privy to their decisions. This photo is from the book The Horizon, History of Africa, American Heritage Publishing. So at the Berlin Conference, revising the General Act of Berlin in 1885, the General Act and Declaration of Brussels, the American Journal of International Law. So whereas the General Act of the African Conference signed at Berlin was primarily intended to demonstrate the agreement of the powers with regard to the general principles which should guide their commercial and civilizing action in the little known or inadequately organized regions of a continent where slavery and the slave trade still furnished, and whereas by the Brussels Declaration it was found necessary to modify for a provisional period of 15 years the system of free imports established for 20 years by article, the reason I'm going through this, the devil is in the details. Territories in question are now under the control of recognized authorities, are provided with administrative institutions suitable to local conditions, and the evolution of the native population continues to make progress. So the assumption is the natives, even though we have African states that have been there for millennia, that they aren't capable of managing their own affairs, and that the Europeans are. Therefore, by military force, we established colonies. And there's a link that can give you the full piece of this, but here's a map of Africa that shows how Africa was divided up. So, notice, for example, in the areas that slavery was very much enforced, from Senegal into Cameroon and Angola. So one of these, the mandates, former German possessions, the reason they're former German possessions is when Germany lost World War I, those territories were taken over by various other countries. So for example, the Germans used to colonize Togo. Now Togo, it went to France. The Gold Coast became Ghana. So depending on who you talk to, for example, there are numerous Africans from places that basically talked about, who are the worst slavers. So there's working neck and neck between the Germans and the Belgians. But opinions vary. French could be pretty bad too. Huh? Yeah. Depends on which country you're from. So, white man's burden. This is always fun. So, the white man's burden, you saw the dictionary definition last week, right? Under white lie, white man's burden. So it's also a movie with Harry Belafonte and John Travolta. So, The White Man's Burden, there were a number of cartoons based on the Rudyard Kipling poem of the same name. So here you have black slaves, or Africans, clearly people of color, being carrying the world powers. Here you have Uncle Sam, okay, John Bull of England, the Kaiser, the French. And remember, the white man's burden is the supposed responsibility to not only colonize the world, but also to civilize those who are being colonized. The white man's burden The first step towards lightening the white man's burden: soap, cleanliness. Teaching the virtues of cleanliness. Now, remember, at this point, the concept of a germ theory was less than 50 years old. Right? And so when they talk about the unwashed masses, well, those are people who are not civilized, even though, to be sure, in colonial period within Europe itself, people did not take frequent baths either. So this is the classic drawing that actually showed up when Kipling's poem was first published. So if you notice, here you have the U.S., a Teddy Roosevelt Rough Rider figure, U.S. on his canteen. He's carrying a black savage, so you can see the wild hair, the big lips, the grass skirt, the spear. You have person buried, wearing boots, so clearly a white man has been killed and improperly buried, came to an early demise. And this white man is carrying the savage up the hill to the schoolhouse. Okay? Where education is seen as civilizing. What kind of education? And the movie, which when it showed here, I was here when it showed here, black people thought it was a comedy. White people were kind of uncomfortable. But basically it's a photo reverse. So given John Travolta, and John Travolta was not a minor actor when this was being made, right? So John Travolta and Harry Belafonte. And so the basic plot of the movie, it's a photo reverse of America where John Travolta is living in South Central as a poor laborer, poor gardener who's working for Harry Belafonte, who's a rich black guy who lives in Beverly Hills. And you see the lawn jockeys are white, and you see kente cloth and all this African statuary in the poolside in these rich houses in Beverly Hills. Essentially, is where it's shot, and John Travolta is being discriminated against and rousted by the cops, and Harry Belafonte calls the cops on him, and he comes back and you've ruined my life and all that kind of stuff. So I'm not laughing at people suffering, but just laughing at the improbability of this actually happening. But it was an Asian director that made it, right? But I think it was lost on a lot of people thinking about this as a photo reverse of America, but that was precisely the point. So I'll read Kipling's poem. Take up the white man's burden. Send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness, or on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. Take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the thread of terror and check the show of pride, by open speech and simple, 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace. Fill full the mouth of famine, and bid the sickness cease. And when your goal is nearest, the end for others sought, watch sloth and heathen folly, bring all your hope to naught. Take up the white man's burden, no iron rule of kings, but toil of serf and sweeper, the tale of common things. The porch ye shall not enter, the roads ye shall not tread. Go, make them with your living, and mark them with your dead. Take up the white man's burden, and reap his old reward, the blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard, the cry of hosts ye humor, slowly, toward the light. Why brought ye from us bondage, our loved Egyptian night? Take up the white man's burden, ye dare not stoop to less, nor call too loud on freedom to cloak your weariness. By all ye will or whisper, by all ye leave to do, the silent, sullen peoples shall weigh your God and you. Take up the white man's burden. Have done with childish days, the lightly proffered laurel, the easy ungrudged praise. Comes now to search your manhood through all the thankless years, cold-edged with dear-bought wisdom, the judgment of your peers. Now, part of the white man's burden, as he's talking about, besides the new caught sullen peoples, that's the colonies, because this is coming after the Berlin Conference. And he's basically saying the virtues of colonialism is you're bringing people from their loved Egyptian night, like Africa is again a dark continent, as if Egypt is not a center of culture. This is the beginning of the separation. So, for example, to call this area of the world the Middle East is a construction from this time to erase that there's any African civilization at all, to refer to it that way. Egypt is not the Middle East, it's Africa. So if you notice where the Middle East is from that map, independently British occupied, Sudan, a British possession, etc. Middle East, eh? So part of what Kipling is talking about is that fill full the mouth of famine. So through agricultural techniques, we're going to feed the starving people. We're going to get rid of sickness by, washing our hands and, doing work to get rid of malaria and all the tropical diseases. And then what will happen is, as many found out in the Peace Corps, they will drop your project. So oftentimes the things that are associated with civilization are dropped by the natives for a variety of reasons. Some good, some bad. But this British poem, published in American magazines, becomes social policy by, for example, when a Senator Tillman talks about the power of this poem, as though coming at the most opportune time possible. You might say just before the treaty reached the Senate, or about the time it was sent to us, there appeared in one of our magazines a poem by Rudyard Kipling, the greatest poet of England at this time. This poem, unique and in some places too deep for me, is a prophecy I do not imagine that in the history of human events any poet has ever felt inspired so clearly to portray our danger and our duty. It's called The White Man's Burden. With the permission of senators, I will read a stanza, and I beg senators to listen to it, for it is well worth their attention. This man has lived in the Indies. In fact, he's a citizen of the world and has been all over it and knows whereof he speaks. Take up the white man's burden. Send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. I will pause here. I intend to read more, but I wish to call attention to a fact which may have escaped attention of senators thus far, that with 5 exceptions, every man in this chamber who has had to do with the colored race in the country voted against the ratification of the treaty. It was not because we are Democrats, but because we understand and realize it is to have 2 races side by side that cannot mix or mingle without deterioration and injury to both, and the ultimate destruction of the civilization of the higher. Guess who he means by higher? We of the South, of course, have borne this white man's burden of a colored race in our midst since their emancipation and before. It was a burden upon our manhood and our ideas of liberty before they were emancipated. It is still a burden, although they have been granted the franchise, that is the vote. It clings to us like the shirt of Nessus, and we are not responsible because we inherited it, and your fathers as well as ours are responsible for the presence among us of that people. Shirt of Nessus? No? Who was Nessus? Who was Mentor, the original Mentor? There is a certain power in understanding the operating myths of the language in which you speak. Okay? Where did Western civilization come from? Greeks and Romans. Okay? So, Mentor was a centaur. Okay? So the teachers of gods and titans, etc., were often supernatural creatures like centaurs. Nessus was a centaur. And I believe it was, he was killed by someone, I think Hercules, mistakenly. And as he was dying, he allowed his blood to soak a shirt. And I think Hercules had to wear it, or someone had to wear it, and the blood burned him. He felt the pain of Nessus dying. So that's what he's talking about. It clings to us like the shirt of Nessus. You can't take it off. It's itching, it's burning, it's painful. And he's basically talking about having to deal with living with black people who are free and living under the vote, with the vote, or attempting to vote, because in 1899 it might be questionable as to whether they're actually getting to exercise the vote. Why do we as a people want to incorporate into our citizenship 10 millions more of differing races, 3 or 4 of them? Because in this time they're also talking race is not just skin color, it's also where you're from. And he's talking about immigration because there's also a wave of that. Okay? But we have not incorporated them yet. Let us see what the English poet has to say about it and what he thinks. Take up the white man's burden, no iron rules of kings, but soil of turf and of serf and sweeper, the tale of common things. The porch ye shall not enter, the roads ye shall not tread. Go make them with your living and mark them with your dead. So basically one of the things he's talking about within this bill is they are looking, what the United States is beginning to do is expand colonial power into places like the Philippines, like Cuba, like other places like that. There's a film which I've never been to Fandor, and apparently my connection wasn't working very well, and I might show the film, but if you could catch the film online, Daughters of the Dust, I made reference to it the other day. This is basically a synopsis of the film, basically talking about an African-American family that prepares to move north in the early 1900s. Using this tale, the film brings to life the changing values, conflicts, and struggles that confront every family as they leave their homeland for the promise of a new and better future. In addition to this, the emotionally charged epic drama explores the unique culture of the Gullah people, descendants of slaves who lived in relative isolation on the Sea Islands off the Georgia coast, as the generations struggle with the decision to leave, their rich Gullah heritage and African roots rise to the surface. All right, let's see. Shown you blood quantum already, right? Yeah, I think so. This. Recognize that? No? Okay. Let me jump back for a second. All right. red and black is maroon. So maroon is a Taino word which means wild and free. It refers in general in the Taino language to African, native, genetic, and cultural hybrids. And are intentional about that. Seminole is another word like that. Indigenous word which means the same thing essentially. African and native, genetic, and cultural hybrids. So it's not just genes, it's also blending culture. Specifically, historically, maroon refers to a group of people in Jamaica and other parts of the Caribbean who created free and egalitarian societies to resist chattel slavery and colonization. This also was depicted somewhat in Daughters of the Dust, too, when one of the daughters in the family marries a Cherokee man, because Georgia is part of the Cherokee traditional nation along with Tennessee and the Carolinas. Coromantee maroons, in particular, use the Akan language and symbology as teaching tools. Last term we talked about the British in their colonies, when they took over Jamaica from the Spanish, basically wanted a group of, they looked to the Akan people of Ghana to, who had a kind of militaristic society. They're the ones that invented the Adinkra symbols, that symbolic alphabet, and they liked their militaristic culture, so they thought that the Akan would be great people to help keep the other slaves in line. Well, instead, of course, the Akan organized the other slaves to basically kick the British out once they got there. And the Coromantee Maroons in particular use the Akan language and that symbology as teaching tools. So Adinkra symbols are an alphabet used to teach stories and transmit culture, and what I've used as the bullet point is the twin Siamese, as they're called, crocodiles. The two crocodiles which basically share the same stomach symbolically, so they shouldn't fight because they feed each other. So we use that word, for example, maroon in contrast to black Indian, the Maroonic Blindians, and other terms in English which refer to skin color alone but have to be infused with more meaning than race. So maroon means free. On both sides of the Atlantic, democracy meant that every human being had a voice in the government. Newcomers were welcome as long as they could contribute to the good of society. There were no illegal aliens. White people were initially welcome because of pre-contact experiences with white people were not particularly negative. Pre-contact there was no concept of uniracial superiority. All right. So, place proper names like Locklear, which means hold fast, like Heather Locklear, which is an East Coast group combining Europeans, natives, and Africans. And Africans and natives both traditionally structure the reality around remembering a connection, culture, and history. So, America abridgment that is limiting freedom begins with cultural amnesia. So the myth of cultural and racial superiority and the divisive strategies of colonization. Now, part of those, when we talk about memes being mutating viral ideas, there are a number of memes. For example, spirit, two-spirit, race, racial superiority, slavery, who are the people, who's a citizen, what's a nation, what's politics, what's blood quantum identity, and I'll show you, like, for example, Hopi, Hippie, Crip, Tongan Crip, Samoan Bloods. So viruses infect cells by using proteins to invade and take over the nucleus of the cell. Memes use ideas, concepts to incorporate themselves into living minds and infect or inoculate those minds against other memes. So maroonage is a counter-colonial practice meme. So, idea, community of suffering, consensus, and shared experience gives you a community of suffering. So as an example here, these memes, on the left at the top, Hopi and Hippie. The Hopi meme used the image of the whirling logs, that construction where the direction is moving sunwise, and the Nazi swastika basically borrowed the same image from Buddhist and Hindu scripture and reversed it. And part of Hopi prophecy is that it predicted the coming of whites to Turtle Island, and that the symbol that was the symbol of life for them, the whirling logs, because it's moving clockwise or sunwise, is a symbol of the forces of life, that a symbol reversing the whirling logs, i.e. the Nazi swastika, would bring the forces of death, and that war would end when 2 gourds of ash were poured on 2 cities. Right? So this was actually done, this part of Hopi prophecy was something like 3,000 years ago, before there was even a Europe, and before whites had even come to Turtle Island. And it's inscribed in the rocks, on the mesas in Hopi land, in Arizona and New Mexico. So, the urban black gang meme Crips, community revolution in progress. And then metropolitan white gang members, rural Pacific Islander, Tongan Crips, and Samoan Bloods. So, maroonage as a meme. You start with your deepest pain as the deepest source of strength. So, when I showed you lynching, that's why we pay attention to that. Because that's basically that level of violence that became normalized is what we're fighting against. So how do you meet violence with further violence, or do you meet violence with superior peace? So part of the violence was then, for example, this idea of racial purity. We're all human. Okay? So this concept that originated among the Moors for horse breeding was not intended to use for humans, because there's no point in counting after your mom is one people and your dad is another people. There's no point in counting after a half. Why bother? Who cares what you look like? You could look like anything. So this idea of racial purity, which this meme is basically Jeffersonian. So the idea is, when you apply it to First Nations, like indigenous people, you are 1/8 Indian for the purposes of removing tribal land rights. And applied to African, the 1-drop rule, 1/64th makes you black. Now, if you understand that a mulatto, half and half, can be blonde hair and blue-eyed, because whatever your gene expression is, that's what it is, right? So, the following chart assumes only one quote-unquote purebred per generation. Now understand, purebred is bullshit. It's fiction. There is no such thing as racial purity, especially after 250,000 years of us mixing, and 22,000 years since the white part of the phenotype emerged. 22,000 years we've all been mixing. There ain't no racial purity. Nice try. All right, so 1/2 to 1 parent, black and mulatto. If it's native, the Lakota word half-breed, or Ieska, which means Ieska means trader, Trader, because it was French traders that were the first Europeans that the Lakota encountered. Quarter, your grandparents, black. One in four of your grandparents is purebred, then you're quadroon. So 1/8. Your great-grandparents, federal Indian cutoff usually is 1/8. In black, it's octoroon. 1/116th, great-great-grandparents, Cherokee cutoff, 1/32nd, great-great-great-great-grandparents. So I'm 1/32nd white. See? No. The 1-drop rule. 1/64. So if one of your great-great-great-great-grandparents was black, you're black. Now understand, a mulatto could be blonde hair and blue-eyed and still basically fall under this rule and be denied access to the vote under Jeffersonian rule. So if you notice the disparity, Is black blood stronger than Indian blood? Because it takes, 1/64th to be black, and then after 1/8 you're not Indian? Like, is black blood stronger? Notice the logic, okay? It's BS. The idea is we want the Indians to disappear because we need their land. That's why this concept was invented, and many people in Indian country have basically embraced this wholeheartedly as if it's real. That's why the preference of, well, if we can't marry a native, let's marry a white person, because the blood is pure, and marrying Mexicans and black people, because they're contaminated, they're basically operating off of this meme. This is the divide and conquer strategy, just like with colorism, except it's quasi-scientific because it's Jefferson. So we'll take this up more Wednesday. Arturo, thank you. Yeah. I'm handing it out Wednesday. Yeah. A week.